Well, welcome to this conversation I'm delighted to have with President Leon Botstein, president of Bard College. Um, my name is Whitney Slaten. I'm assistant professor of music, teaching courses mainly in ethnomusicology, but also jazz studies and sound studies in Bard's music program. The title for our conversation today is very much meant to consider the practice of listening in music studies at a time during this tragic coronavirus pandemic. And the title for this gathering I've identified is Listening for Repetition in Moments of Interruption. In the music program, in my own work, I engage examples of experimental ethnography, the discourse of jazz studies, as well as examples of ontology and cosmology in music. Listening figures rather centrally in my methodology for that work. And for ethnomusicology at Bard, students develop ethnographic inquiry through encounters of repetitions that theorize features of music's social contexts. It's an exciting space within our program for students to, in particular, explore writing about music, writing inspired by deep listening. So now on to the coronavirus and this pandemic. I'm struck with the following sort of conclusion at present as it's ongoing right now, that for the listening global citizen, the significance of repetition in music must take on a greater meaning in a time like this. For our discussion, I've selected a moment in a recording of Maestro Leon Botstein's conduction of George Gershwin's Piano Concerto in F, the third movement. And I'm considering conducting and listening to jazz in Yiddish musical aesthetics. This was a recording with a performance by the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra under Botstein's direction, and Mark Bevington, the pianist. I'm drawn to the ways in which people, subject to difficult circumstances, listen to music to feel belonging, particularly when such circumstances produce injuries of marginalization or isolation. What does it mean for a listener to critically identify such cultural affinities amidst racist stereotypes that had been the condition for industrial success in American music? This reminds me of the ways in which audiences of such forms have listened to instrumental jazz improvisations as surrogate speech phenomena, or for Jewish American heritage in the music of composers like Gershwin. For instance, what comfort may there be for the listener who hears Yiddish aesthetics amidst African American aesthetics in Gershwin's compositions, as musicologist Naomi Andre discusses the dual narratives of Jewish American and African American representations in Porgy and Bess. Within this particular example, I'd like us to discuss, Mr. President, within the third movement, I encounter a repeated melodic figure with a pronounced syncopation. And so in other other recordings I've heard of this passage, I hear this figure like this. And it just here in many other instances of just being played through that way, in a very matter-of-fact sort of fashion, where more of an exaggerated sort of approach is given in the opening measures of that movement with crash cymbals and all these sorts of things. I don't hear that in this version. And in particular, what I'm getting at in this is that there's a certain sort of balance in the music of the 20s, particularly in New York, where the exaggeration of African-American stereotype is in fashion, is quite popular. And as it may be a stretch to consider an example like this for the coronavirus pandemic, I'm in particular drawn to the ways that the rebalancing through listening can elicit new sort of social bonds, ways to reconceive of expressions of culture that had at once separated us, to think about how critical listening and performance can subvert these things that keep us apart It's one of the sort of overarching themes here. In any case, in your version, Mr. President, I hear a lot of adjustment to those tendencies, and for it, I hear this sort of emphasis. Pardon the pianism there. So I hear much more of a pronounced syncopation in this moment that I don't hear in other versions. And so, I mean, even beyond the occasion of our meeting, I've long wanted to ask you about this. But especially here in our context now, where Gershwin is often accused of so many things culturally, particularly from the vantage point of African-American music, I find, in the notes I have here just to read them, that my listening yields that the popular exaggerations of African-American musical sounds of Gershwin's time are ethically de-emphasized in this example in favor of foregrounding what I'm hearing, and this is breaking out now for the discussion, of maybe perhaps a resurrection of the Yiddish musical or linguistic expression that, you know, might have been couched behind the popular tendency to put forward, you know, what others have called the Black musical aesthetics of this sort of time. Is this so? And if so, how could such foregrounding culturally recontextualize Gershwin for American listeners who hope for a broader social and political reconciliation? This is the sort of breakout point. And I wonder if we could discuss, you know, moments that led to that recording or to that section of music, what your approach to that project was as it relates to this sort of issue of representation.
Well, first of all, Whitney, thank you very much for participating in this conversation. It's a lot to wrap one's head around in a way. What's interesting is that you mentioned the field of ethnomusicology, which is your training, and those of us who are, as you are, both performers and scholars, have, and students should realize that in a way, have a funny dialogue with ourselves, you know, about, what we're thinking about and what we're trying to understand through language, writing about it or teaching about it, and then having to get on stage or in an ensemble or rehearsal room and try to play. And so that's an interesting tension. What you do professionally as an ethnomusicologist is really very similar to what those of us who are just write about music history. In other words, the kind of research and questions you ask. So on the issue of, which I think is very interesting, the question of repetition. So repetition, as you know, was used and is used in many musical expressions as a mechanism for orienting the meaning or significance of what's trying to be said. You say it once, but music isn't quite a language. And so, and there are people, I think they may be right, that believe there's no such thing as repetition in music, because even in the examples that you played, the first time is different from the second time, even in the same set of keys, right? So since music is continuous, there are two ways of thinking about music. One is a succession of events, and then, right, one after another, and then the whole thing as a duration, and then how you remember it. You may actually, your memory is not always accurate. We don't always remember very well what we heard, and especially in improvisatory forms, where repetition or variation form, where the repetition is very important because you're changing it. You're not actually not repeating yourself. We used to think, when people learn to go to piano lessons and they said, repeat it. And I always thought, well, there's no such thing really, because The second time I'm playing the same notes, but the second time over is, if people will pardon the analogy, it's the second kiss. That's different from the first kiss, you know. It's a kiss. You may do it exactly the same way, but it means something different. That's why in some cultures, when they hug once and then the other side. For whatever mean the first, it looks like you're doing the same thing twice, but you're not doing the same thing twice because it's in sequence. And music isn't really a language, so you're absolutely right. You know, if I say that the sky is blue, the sky is blue. That kind of repetition has meaning, but it's a little weird to do it. What we do in music is a little bit different, as you're right. And every time we say it, we don't actually say it the same way. The sky is blue, the sky is blue, the sky is blue, you know, sky is blue, you know. We can say the three, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of variation. On the question of Gershwin, so as you rightly point out, it's a very troubled subject. And I'm not sure there's a right point of view. I'm a little cautious, as I'm sure you are, about reducing our stereotype of either race or ethnicity.
Yes.
There's not one way to be black. There's not one way, you know, there are people who are critical of President Obama. He wasn't quite black enough, you know, in somebody's point of view. I'm not Jewish enough from many people's point of view. You know, I was once in a meeting about some project with a bunch of Jewish educators, and an Orthodox rabbi said, you know, why should I be talking to you? Who says you're Jewish?
Mm.
You're not Jewish by my standards. I mean, you don't keep the Sabbath, you know. You don't eat kosher food. You know, just because you're circumcised doesn't make you Jewish. So my answer to him was, well, yeah, I am Jewish because I'm on a list. I'm an official member of the Jewish community. I'm a member of a synagogue. I pay my dues. If you push a button, you say, Jews in America, my name's going to be there because I belong to an organization which identifies me as Jewish. The rabbi, to his credit, said, that's a good answer. It's a good answer. No, but it didn't solve the question of the one. So George Gershwin, Jewishness. So as you know, we're talking about a very odd time. In the 20s, there was a very different relationship between the immigrant Jewish experience in New York and the Black experience in New York. The NAACP, for example, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, had its origins in an alliance against racism between Jews and Blacks as a result of the great pogroms in Kishinev, which were world famous, where the Russians killed a lot of Jews. And there was a sense, which is hard for us to remember now, of solidarity. We Jews, were not considered just other types of white people. We weren't white people, we were Jews. And because there was real anti-Semitism. So someone like Gershwin, there's a scene in a very controversial movie you know very well, it's called The Jazz Singer. Right. This is a notorious movie because Al Jolson, who was a Jewish actor, singer, right, plays the son of a cantor, right, liturgical cantor, right, who's dying, and he's a pop singer, you know, he's a pop singer. And he has a little nostalgia. He wants to get away from his roots and his family, and he becomes very popular. His father is dying, and it's the evening of Yom Kippur. It's cold and dry night, and his mother comes to beg him to come home to the synagogue to sing the most famous portion of the evening liturgy of the arguably the most holy day in the Jewish calendar, right? And he's in the dressing room, and his mama comes in, right? And he's putting on blackface. And in the mirror, what does he see? he sees the image of his father, the Orthodox Jew.
Hmm.
Now, that's an emblem of what was on the mind of someone like George Gershwin, was that his fellow Black neighbors and citizens were closer to him than the white people. And they suffered the same kind of, in his mind, that's not comparable. The Black experience is much tougher than any experience an American Jew, because we are, by our skin color, white. But that doesn't diminish the amount of deep-seated solidarity. So the borrowing didn't feel awkward to someone like Gershwin. I don't think his intention was either insulting or demeaning, which is why now there is never an American production of Porgy and Bess that doesn't have exclusively Black singers on the stage, which seems totally right. And it works. And as you know, many jazz greats of African American descent have used song material from Gershwin in their work. So it's fascinating. I think you're right that both by harmony and by gesture, there's a fair amount of expression of suffering intended. So you're talking about, in a coronavirus, how am I going to communicate to you how sad I am, or my sense of loss, right? Music is a great way of doing it, right? Yeah. So there is in both traditions, the African American tradition, in the Black spiritual, for example, classic, and in the liturgy and the popular music of immigrant Jews from Eastern Europe, there's a fair amount of similarity in how do you express sadness or joy in a bad situation. You know what I mean? How do you do that? And so there are gestures which, so I rather think that music, this kind of borrowing, or this kind of, is an effort to do the holding of hands between people that language doesn't do.
Sure. Oh, for sure. I think I am. I agree wholeheartedly with a lot of that, particularly about the contrast between music and language. I guess the framework for my question comes from, I think, the broader, I guess it's a problematic term, but mainstream reception beyond New York City, for instance, beyond these key moments of contact between the African American, Jewish American communities, that here's this larger than life figure now, Gershwin, and he becomes emblematic of the United States,
yes,
and
and
American,
yeah,
and that sort of thing. And I think a distortion that comes from this that elides the specificity, I think, that you're bringing up, is that he merely appropriated Black music.
okay, but let me turn it around. So, right before the coronavirus, I was about to do the first concert that got canceled at Carnegie Hall. Was an all Gershwin, an all Ellington concert that I was conducting, right, with an orchestra that was primarily white, but with Marcus Roberts and his jazz ensemble, who's a very distinguished African American jazz pianist whom I've worked with before, and his ensemble, which includes one of actually Wynton Marsalis's relatives. As many people know, Jazz Lincoln Center has its summer camp here at Bart, and so it's a Black jazz band, and we have African American classical musicians in the orchestra, but it's a largely white orchestra, and I'm conducting, and the music is all by Duke Ellington. So Ellington has a little bit. He's also a Pan-American figure, if you will. He's a kind of a. One could argue that he, is probably the most important, American musician of the 20th century. Together with Billy Strayhorn, the guy who worked with him. But so, and you were talking about the recording. Now that complicates the matter along the lines you're interested in, because this was done with an English orchestra and an English pianist. Yes. So they don't know what we're talking about, as far as they're
Right.
concerned. Yeah, they don't know,
Well,
um,
they could, but they not, may not.
they may not. Yeah, what do they know? They don't know from Alabama, from Chicago, that America is a kind of a distant, simplified entity.
Well,
So
sure.
they're playing. I found doing. I was hired to do the recording, and I was happy to do it. The Rhapsody in Blue is on there, and I've got rhythm variations on there too. It's an old Gershwin CD, but I felt okay because, as you suggest, I'm an immigrant much later than Gershwin's family. So we came as children after the Second World War. So we're a little different in where we come from and who we are as a family, let's say from the majority of American Jews who descend from families that emigrated in the late 19th century, early 20th century, just as most African Americans descend from the slaves who came here during the slave trade. So there are different variations in who people are and how they see themselves. But from the English point of view, where actually anti-Semitism is more prevalent, I think you're talking about a flattening out, which is absolutely right, which is true of all overplayed music. So you talk about repetition.
Yes.
What you're up against in trying to unravel, what you're trying to do is, in a very profound way, unravel something that you and I both live with, which is, I mean, how many times can you hear Rhapsody in Blue? How many times can you hear the Concerto in F? How many times can you listen to a Beethoven symphony or a Mozart or the Marriage of Figaro? And so there is a kind of recording has intervened in our understanding of repetition. When you talk about repetition, it's interesting. You go to the piano. You're a musician. I see there's an instrument on your piano, right?
Yes.
When you think about music, you're using your hands, your body. You're making the sounds. It's in real time, even though we're maybe recording this. But a lot of people listening is now more peculiar because what they're listening to doesn't have the slight uniqueness of every moment you're playing. So I'm going to record you, right? I say, Whitney, we're going to record you, right? And you practice, you sit down, you start to record. Every student, every one of our conservatory students, every one of our music students knows, Thurman Barker, you run to jazz, he knows that no two things are alike. When you try to edit something, you realize, unless you use it over and over again. Now, people listen by using it over and over again. You have your favorite rock song. You have your favorite piece, and you have your favorite recording, and you put it on your iPhone, and or you put it on your iPad, and you listen to it over and over and over again. That's a kind of repetition which I don't fully understand myself, never having done it. You know what I mean? And you don't do it either, because no musician actually does that, because we're frightened that I'll lose my own soul.
That's right.
I'll listen. Some other person is going to do this, and said, "No, oh my God, I'm going to sound like that other person. I'm not that other person. I'm me."
Mm-hmm.
So repetition is an odd one, because in this coronavirus situation, I've always thought the best thing we can tell our students is to make music, make sound themselves.
Sure. I guess in an extra musical consideration, I'm drawn to the fact that this pandemic has interrupted so much. Not to make it binary opposition between interruption and repetition, but I guess my end point is, the wonder is, if this moment, this situation has brought about a want for any sort of symbolic, iteration of repetition, and if that guides listening in new ways. I mean, it doesn't seem that Fauci has found the way out for any short period.
No, but you're absolutely, Whitney. No, you're absolutely right.
Sure.
So there's one thing to repeat. Most of our students in music are desperate for things to start up again, because what they identify with their activity is to be in the same space and the same acoustic space. And therefore, the repetition you're talking about isn't mechanical. It's expressive,
Mm-hmm.
um, and it's made. It's not simply consumed. So it's less passive. So this interruption, I think, has created a lot of eagerness, um, and it has a kind of it makes us realize how privileged we have been without thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, to be an ensemble, to get a group together,
Sure, sure, sure.
it's a play. You know.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Yeah, and yeah, the students now, especially with senior projects and so forth, you know, feeling the rupture of what they were accustomed to, you know, with ensembles and rooms and facility, and having to submit videos of rehearsals and things like this. But they're doing it. They're doing it with a poise that's quite remarkable.
Both they and you, the faculty, are doing a fantastic job. But we're hardest hit. The two fields that I think are hardest hit are music and dance.
Mm.
And then
Oh,
right behind them are the theater, people in theater, of all the performing arts, um, and the experimental sciences, the people who are in laboratories, you know, got to work together and do lab stuff. Those people are probably the most disadvantaged in continuing what they want to do by the pandemic.
sure, 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 sure. I want to turn to the discussion of your legacy with the concept of listening in your research across years, and many, you know, your primary works as well as articles. And I'm struck now, having to teach courses on Google and Zoom, that that's all we're left with, you know, in terms of our coursework. But it's not a pessimistic conclusion. I think we're maybe gaining something by each of us having headphones or some sort of way to have close listening in class. I read an article you've written about Haydn and the demise of philosophical listening. And it was fascinating, your discussion of Adam Smith's assessments of Haydn in the public versus Herder, the 19th century sort of advocacy for something beyond the philosophical listening project. I'm often engaging the balance of art music, popular music, folk music, but in our contemporary moment, not just with COVID-19, but for music studies at this point and moving forward. How would you imagine listening sort of awakening, you know, as a mode of engagement for music studies?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fascinating. I, I don't actually have never really quite understood the distinction that many people make between kinds of music.
Mm.
You know, we don't really do it with language. You speak English, I speak English, American English.
Mhm.
People listening all speak American English. Now, everybody speaks a little differently, you know. Some people have different rhetorics and different use of vocabulary. There's much overlapping, and the same is true in music. So, you know, I think listening in isolation by yourself, right, as opposed to listening in a group, listening on a machine as opposed to acoustic music. The context of listening, in my view, is very, very important, and the kind of meaning. The great thing about listening to music, no matter what kind of music it is, it can be anything from country and western to independent forms of rock music, can be classic rock, can be dance music, it can be so-called classical music. You know, there are two things that one is that, especially with any music that has any duration, time, that we can be in the same space, even the same digital space, and have a shared experience where we will never quarrel about the meaning of it. We have a conversation. Let's talk about politics. Let's talk about President Trump, Governor Cuomo, you know, about, I don't know, any controversial issue in the United States, the language we use immediately, right away, typecasts who we are. People are looking for signs, right? Is this person conservative? Is this person liberal? Is this person religious? Is this person an atheist? Is this person... Oh, in music, we can be in the same space and you don't have any idea. I don't have any idea what you're thinking. I don't have a clue. I don't have a clue what the significance you're drawing from it. Right? Now, you don't have any clue. Neither of us. And yes, it's shared, it's not communicated, it's held private, but it's a public experience. It's a very unusual medium. Music is a very unusual medium, which is why in religious systems, it assumes, in many religions all over the world, it assumes an odd divine role, because it's more powerful than speech without shedding people. You know, in the Abrahamic tradition, we have the Tower of Babel. You know, everybody knows that story. You know, so because they wanted to make a language, they went to God, and then they broke up all the languages, right? Now, music is the one thing that remains with us that doesn't create a Tower of Babel experience. You know what I mean? Everybody, and that's where your repetition. People, they recognize it, they connect to it, they listen to it, they create a meaning. They create their own story to themselves, hanging on to the same music, and that's almost impossible to do in language. We can barely agree about, you know, a simple thing, and so I always think of listening as a historically contingent. In other words, the way we're doing listening now is influenced. People sometimes think listening is sort of like eating. It isn't. You know, our ancestors ate fish, and it probably had different valence of meaning than our eating the fish. But there is our attitude. But actually, it's not a static process. It's a very historically contingent. So what people think they're getting out of music, or what they think it means to them and how they make it part of themselves, it never reaches the point where it inspires conflict. There are no misunderstandings, except musical ones. You know, I'm in the wrong place. There are musical misunderstandings, but then, you know what I mean? There might be misunderstanding how we phrase something, but even when we discuss how we might do that, I'm not really sure always why you want to do it that way. I'm happy to do it your way, because my consider. I say, often in a rehearsal, a student in an orchestra or an ensemble will make a phrase, and it's not the way I had anticipated that person playing it. But I think about it and I say, if the person plays it the same way the second time, if I think there's something that is not persuasive about it, but if I often think, well, okay, let's work with that. Now, do I really understand what that student, that player was trying to say? But my listening is empathetic. It's not divisive. I'm trying to figure out, why is she doing this? Why is she doing it this way? Why is he doing it this way? And I never thought about doing it that way. And hey, that's interesting. Does it change the meaning of the phrase for me? I don't know. Then we're going to memory. When you go home and I go home, the difference that musicians have is we sort of remember in our heads. Stuff goes around in our heads. It's not exactly the way it happened, but we're chewing on it and we embellish it.
Sure. I ask about listening because we have a fantastic conservatory at Bard, and in the program we have students who do not perform musical instruments. They have a close affinity to music, and in their writing projects, I often ask them to get closer to sound, describe the sound. Not beholden to any particular tradition of analysis, but from where you stand. If you were to zoom in on a moment, as I've shown here, what do you imbue in it? How does it mesh with a sort of tradition of thought about musical sound. And, I often encounter, the marginalization of the status of listening compared to their pursuits that are very optic, the reliance on the sight of the legacy of positivism, to sort of prove existence through witnessing. And that, it's often quite new for them to listen, those who've not been trained in an instrument. And I'm afraid that the current state of music education in this country will impact the new students in college, such that many more of them will be without, access to an instrument, or pedagogy, or ensembles and things like this. And so, as a junior scholar and professor, I think often about how listening will be the means through which we revitalize music studies.
I think you're right. I think you're totally correct. It doesn't mean we shouldn't try to make an effort.
For
We
sure.
should to improve music education where people are making music. Listening is not. I agree with you. I think you're absolutely right. There's no reason to denigrate listening, and there's no doubt that we live in a highly visual culture where sight. People still say, "I'm going to see a concert" as opposed to hearing a concert. And I often, with fellow musicians, always tell them, make believe that you're performing to a blind audience. Try to make the case with the sound. I mean, you and I both have seen a lot of performers who are great actors. They move about, they have a whole act,
Sure.
and there's a lot of, visual fire and brimstone, And both in jazz and in classical music, there have been greats who are really, they force you to listen because there's nothing to look at. They're only something to hear, you know what I mean? There was the great conductor and composer, Richard Strauss was a great conductor, and he once gave 10, like the 10 commandments of conducting. And one of the 10 commandments is the conductor should never sweat, only the audience. So the idea that the tension of listening should, the same way you watch a film and, you don't know the good people are going to win or the bad people are going to win, and is the hero or the heroine going to, get out of the jam they're in the film? And there's kind of tension and time, your perception of time changes, and your heartbeat gets faster and, you're all, sitting on the edge of your seat, as they say. Well, you have to make that happen through the years. And that's why it's great to say sometimes when I say you close your eyes, all right? And it is harder. It is harder, and I think you're right that the coronavirus isolation does increase the contemplative idea of listening. I got nothing to do, and for me, a long piece of music, it's by Philip Glass or by George Walker, they're too long for me, It's 40 minutes long. I see on YouTube it's 40 minutes long. And but now I got nothing to do. I got nowhere to go. So suddenly, I hope this increases the patience. And I agree. People used to criticize listening. I did myself. I was, I think, wrong as a passive act. It isn't. I think you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. It's not a passive. We're not. You're not like Hamlet's uncle. We're not pouring poison into the ear of the. While he's sleeping. There's something. You got. It's like dancing. you have to be on the floor and move around. You're not inert. And so which is why one of the very often with players, you often have them move as they play in the rhythm. Let's say in a 3/4 time waltz. Singers in opera, for example, there's an ensemble or where there is this kind of a pulse, and it has supposed to have a dance-like feeling. You get them to dance with their bodies in the rehearsal, so they get the feel of the rhythm. So listening is that kind of thing. And it is, and as you're absolutely right, the study of music, there are so three basic players. They're the people who are playing it, the people who are writing it, could be the same person, and they're the people to whom they're playing to or expect to listen.
I think about that third group as, I have general interest students in ethnomusicology classes. And if I think about their trajectory beyond Bard, the graduate of a liberal arts college, I wonder about patronage, and I wonder about the efficacy of what a time closely listening in college could mean for a new generation and a cultivation of a sort of new patron to music. I mean, I often think about this with jazz.
Oh, you hit the nail on the head. We're building audiences. And that's the legacy of generations of terrific undergraduate teaching in art history, where people go to museums.
Oh, sure, right.
And we used to do it. You also identify something which we do, but not all. Your profession and my profession have been over professionalized. So you go to graduate school, no one wants to teach music 101. The course that they used to call drop the needle.
Oh, right. Okay.
But the fact is that those were great things. If they were well done, they can be well done. So, most of our students, don't know the history of the music they love, whether it's rock and roll, whether it is jazz, whether it's rap music, whatever genre you want. They have a history, and the new artists have the old artists in their head, and not every listener has that old. They don't. So so the curiosity about listening, these courses are guides to them, and the experience. And it's like anything else. The more you know, how can you expect someone? That's why the Protestant Reformation came about, because they wanted the faithful to read the Word of God. Maybe just listening to somebody, talk to you in a language you don't understand, and you just sort of leave it holy. It's just a lot of hocus pocus, right? A lot of magic. I don't get it. Why the Catholic Church? Under John the 23rd, why they turn the priest around? Why is he now celebrating Mass in the native language? Because people want to understand. So that's what we're doing, basically. What seems like they don't have to know any technical terms, right? They don't have to know, but it's very helpful in life. There are a lot of doctors who are real music lovers and patrons and amateurs. And listening is a form of empathy, and listening to a patient. We use the same word. Did you listen to your patient? When the patient came in and said, I think I have coronavirus, doctor, did you listen to the patient? You examined the patient, but did you listen? A parent, do you listen to your children? You go to church, pastor says something. Did you listen to him? So the idea of listening to music and the training of it, and a part of listening is remembering, and that's a tremendous mental thing. I think people who study music just to like it expand their analytical powers through focusing memory. I'm only as smart as what I can remember.
Sure, sure, sure.
That's why we identify dementia with the loss of memory. Right? I can't remember anymore who I am. Well, that's a tragic situation because it contrasts to a time where I could remember not only who I am, but I could remember a hell of a lot of stuff, which allowed me to function in the world. So taking class of music in a liberal arts, somebody who takes your class, absolutely advances whatever ambitions they may have in life, whether it's in science or in law. There's nothing useless about it. And the patronage, of course, question, of course, is that because we're in a society that doesn't believe the arts deserves public patronage. So that's a different conversation, but we're not going to convince our fellow citizens to change their ways, especially in this economic crisis. We're, unlike the New Deal, we're sort of low people on the totem pole.
Sure, 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 sure. Yeah, for sure. I don't know if we're beyond our time limit, but I guess to sort of wrap things up, I guess to go, or to, as they say, go full circle. I just imagine my students at home, some of them are nearby in Tivoli, some of them are on the West Coast or wherever they may be, and the screen time, and all this optical engagement is something that makes me want to advocate for listening, particularly in this sort of political media engagement where, a new level of xenophobia and racism has been erupted by who's infected more and where the infection came from, and that visuality doesn't do well with race. But
Visual, yeah, it should do well with race.
it should do, but it tends not to. The camera on this person and that person and the post about this, and but my effort in bringing in that moment of Gershwin is to wonder, what would new kinds of listening to the sounds of popular culture or media do to sort of subvert the assumptions we make based on seeing the symbols of culture or society, and that could inform, music studies as a turn at moments like this. That jazz studies could be engaged with listening, or orchestral music study, could be about listening to the third movement in a way to imagine that dance form, or these other sorts of things. And so, to me, that's what the pandemic has brought up. It's brought up these questions about, all right, we're disrupted. So, but what can we do with that disruption? And when we're not disrupted, can we pursue something that was inspired, at least in a positive way, by this moment of reflection?
Yeah, I think you're totally right and asking the right question. So let's go to the interruption. So I find all this Zoom stuff and Google stuff and Skype and all the platforms, they're terrific. But they're not the replacement of the real thing. Second is the sound of your voice. The sound of your voice makes the picture worth seeing. So listening, not only what you say, but the sound of your voice is makes the picture work. And I think that when you listen to something, you change its meaning, the intentional meaning. So whatever Gershwin had in mind or how he thought, how we actually begin to forget the negative aspects of the way we identify another person. And realize that there is no that the insider outsider, that the labels we put on people we're multiple things, and the thing listening to music can do is to teach us the irreplaceability of the individual. So in other words, every listening experience is somewhat different, and you can't all herd them into a one box, and so maybe, as you were saying, how you read someone's performance of, I mean, the Gershwin example you use, it maybe somebody write it off to, this is the way the English hear American jazz. It's more English than anything else. I'm irrelevant. We got 90 people in the Royal Philharmonic there and a British pianist. So who am I? I'm just, in there for the ride. I mean, in other words, so also remember that, and it's complicated, and that's great to complicate something that seems so simple. It is fascinating. I don't think we Americans, black or white, own Gershwin any more than the Russians own Tchaikovsky or the French own Debussy, right? When you hear German jazz bands and you think, wait a minute, what's going on here? There's something, and you realize, wait a minute, that's their jazz. I once did a Duke Ellington piece when I was in Israel. I was music director of the Radio Orchestra of Israel. I did Night Creature. So it's a jazz band and orchestra, and the jazz band were all Russians, Russian Jews, who had emigrated to Israel. And, and I realized that, I think Duke Ellington would have been thrilled, here are a bunch of people in the Middle East, playing Night Creature. Sound great. Did they do it the same way, let's say, that Marcus Roberts, or, is there an authenticity to any of them? I'm not sure. Once you put it out there, that's your part. People make it anything they want. It can be a soundtrack for selling automobiles, the William Tell Overture, right, by Rossini. For years, generation, it was the Lone Ranger, right? That was the Lone Ranger. Today's student never heard of the Lone Ranger. They don't. So that's now lost its meaning. When you rehearse it with a younger orchestra, nobody thinks, Ohio Silver. Nobody thinks it's the Lone Ranger anymore. So it's, remember how music was used as backgrounds for cartoons?
Cartoons, for sure.
Yeah. How do you deal with that? It's a fascinating part of human behavior. I'm glad you study it and work on it.
Thank you. It's my perception that we've covered a nice arc here.
Oh, yeah. Well, listen, as long as people didn't fall asleep in the middle, we're fine.
It seems convincing, right? Okay.
That's the thing we fear most,
Right.